Welcome to the third edition of Ossining Reads, a monthly show about books and reading, produced by Ossining High School. I'm Bob Minzesheimer. I'm an Ossining parent and a book reviewer. And I'm here with my co-host, Benjamin Feinstein, who is the managing editor of The Current, the Ossining High School newspaper. And Benjamin will introduce this month's guest and ask the first question of our conversation.
All right. Well, today's guest is Ms. Janelle Mondanero, who is an English teacher here at Ossining High School. And to start off the conversation, I'll just ask you, of the books that you brought here today, which one is your favorite?
Well, my top favorite is at the top of the stack. The Color Purple by Alice Walker is my favorite book of all time. I actually read it so many times when I was younger that my copy fell apart and I had to buy a new one. This I borrowed from our English department, this copy. But the characters come alive, they change over time. Every time I read it, I get something else from it. And I think that it's one of those books that everybody should read at some point in his or her life.
For readers who have not read it yet, what's it about and why should they read it?
It's about a woman named Celie, really from the time she's a childhood up through later adulthood. And it's about her struggles as a black woman in the South, dealing with abuse, dealing with neglect, and really dealing with her own identity. And through friendships and family relationships, she learns how to love, but she also learns how to love herself and really recreate herself.
And did you see the movie based on it?
I did. It's brilliant. It's beautiful. Steven Spielberg did leave out, he consulted with Alice Walker on the project. He did leave out some major parts, and he kind of did it on purpose. And I think that probably was a mistake, but at the same time, in terms of its own project, it was a really beautiful film.
And one more Color Purple question.
Yes.
Oprah Winfrey, how was she in the movie?
She played Sophia, who was one of my favorite characters. She's the strong woman who stands up to abuse, gets broken down, but manages to stand back up again, and really is an inspiration to Celie as well. So,
Right. Benjamin, what books? What of the books you brought? I'll turn your question back on yourself.
All right, that's fair. I mean, my books aren't in any particular order, and I've liked and read too many books to have a favorite. But the one on top for me is called The Toaster Project. It is by Thomas Thwaites, and it's a very peculiar book. It's nonfiction, which isn't what I typically read, but like other nonfiction books that I've read and like, this one kind of has the author go on a knowledge quest, if you will, to figure out how to do something. And in this case, just build a toaster, just a common everyday appliance, completely from scratch, like mining the metal himself, making the circuit boards himself, just doing everything from scratch. So.
And does he?
He does.
And does it work?
He didn't want to test it out. He was a bit afraid of how safe or not safe, actually, it would be. The picture of it is the one on the cover, and you can see it's not exactly the prettiest contraption. He did test it out just with a piece of wood, and it was able to heat it up enough to burn it and function in that way. But when it was done, he thought that was more just useful in order to see how processed and how hard it is for the everyday person to build something as simple as a toaster. So.
Is that a book you read for fun or for school?
Yes.
Not that those are exclusive.
No.
But
they do overlap
wasn't
a
an
lot.
assignment.
No, this was not an assignment, actually. When I was a kid, some of the earliest machines that I would draw were actually toasters, so kind of as a joke, I got this book for my birthday a couple years back, and it turned out to be a lot more interesting than I would have expected for just being a joke book. So it's a really good book.
If I could ask a broader question, when you read a book for pleasure,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to reading a book because it's assigned in class, is there much of a difference in the way you read it?
No, rarely, if ever. I mean, I hate to admit this in front of you, but when I'm assigned a book in class, I don't really approach it with the intent of any assignments. And if I need to, I'll reread it afterwards with that in mind, but I just read it as if I'm reading any other book.
Right. Ms. Marinero, you're both a reader and a teacher. How do you approach
Yes.
that kind of question between reading for pleasure and then reading for credit or because someone's going to grade us?
Because we tell you to. Yeah. That's always a tough balance. I mean, I'm such a reader. I've always been such a reader. And so, just like with any subject, for me, science was my, struggle. So to get me to love science the way that you could get me to love reading, that was never going to happen. So I try my best to help inspire students to love reading. If there's a really struggling student, but they've had that one book that they loved, I will do anything I can to try to find something that might be comparable to that book. But I think that there is something to be said for, I'm doing this because someone told me I had to do this, because then you're exposed to new things that you may not have been exposed to, or maybe you're challenged in a way that you weren't challenged in school. So.
Do you remember as a kid what was your favorite book?
I started reading Stephen King when I was in 3rd grade, which,
Which I assume was not assigned by your 3rd grade teacher?
No, and my parents, are probably horrified now that they know some of the inappropriate content in Stephen King novels. But they were like, "Oh, she's an advanced reader. This is great."
Which novel was this?
It. Yes, one of his longest. Right. And yeah.
Was it scary? Did you find it scary?
I found it very scary. I mean, I walked around with my pigtails and with the hardcover library copy, like, my mom let me get this from the library. Right. But I loved it, and so that continued throughout the years. Horror fiction, horror films, and I still read King as much as possible to this day.
Are any King novels on the Ossining High School curriculum?
No, but I seriously just the other day started thinking about, I read a short story with my 9th graders, Here There Be Tigers, which is much more mild. It's from Skeleton Crew, and more approachable for younger kids, but I would love to teach a Stephen King novel. Yeah.
Benjamin, are you a King fan at all?
I really haven't read much of his work. The only one of his pieces that I actually remember well is his short story Quitters Inc. I read that in a summer program actually at Johns Hopkins, and that was a lot of fun. That was through a whole suspense and mystery course, and we watched a short clip from Cat's Eye that has that short story in it afterwards, so it was neat to see how that worked together as well.
I would recommend his memoir writing advice book, which is called, I think, On Writing.
Yeah.
On Writing. It's sort of it's a sort of an unusual type of book about writing, since half of it's about his own life and how he became a writer. But very readable and also very useful. I think there's a lot of good practical advice. Ms. Montanaro, it looks like you brought another King book.
I did.
A more recent one. And
this
why?
This is his newest one. I found out through my friend's post on Facebook that this had come out, and I ordered it right away, and told my mother, who then said, but I ordered it for you for Christmas. Sorry, Mom. But it's fantastic, and it's one of those books that I am purposely not reading every day because I don't want to devour it and then have it be over. So I'm trying to, savor it a little bit.
Without giving away too much of the plot, you want to tell people what it's about?
Oh, so good. All right, so it's about this boy who, it starts off, it's really kind of an epic story throughout his life, but it's this boy who meets the new reverend in town. And he kind of the reverend really has a meltdown after and loses his faith, gets kicked out of the town because he can't be reverend there anymore because he gives this sermon about how God doesn't exist. And so it's about the main character meeting this person again, and then meeting this person again throughout his life, and that's all I will say. Okay. And lightning is involved.
Great.
Yes.
Benjamin, you want to talk about any of the other books you've brought?
All right. I'll take one from a different genre now, I guess. I'll go with this one, I think. It's called Sabriel, or Sabriel, depending on how you want to pronounce it. It's by Garth Nix, who's one of my favorite authors. A lot of his work I read earlier on and is meant for younger audiences, but this one definitely isn't. And if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong, this was actually his first novel, and in my opinion, probably one of his better. He's an Australian author, so apart from the spelling,
right.
it's a good book.
And what's it about?
Well, it takes place in a different universe, different world, where there are two countries, one of which has magic and knights and all of that. The main character on the cover is a necromancer, for example. But then there's a wall separating it from a different country where magic never existed and where people start to use machines and industrialize instead. And so one is, the magic side is on the brink of destruction, all of their governments falling apart, whereas the more modern side is on the verge of industrializing. and there's conflict between the two, and also an overwhelming, like, growing dark magic influence. And it's a pretty interesting plot and story, and they go in depth with the whole world development.
And again, you're reading this just for fun?
Yes.
Okay.
This is the first book in a trilogy, in fact, and he wrote a prequel book afterwards, which I got an advanced copy of, and I'm reading currently. Okay. So it's definitely a good series.
And how did you get an advanced copy?
I got it through a library program, actually, through the Ossining Public Library.
Okay, and in order to review it, or just
to read.
Okay.
Over this summer, a lot of the libraries in the area, if you read X number of books, they reward you by letting you select an advanced copy of a different book. So I got it that way.
Right. Let me ask a process question of you both. When and how do you read? When, what part of when, at what time of day, and also we all have physical books here as opposed to Kindles or Nooks. Do you read print books or ebooks or?
I really only read print books. I mean, my brother has a Nook and my dad an iPad, but I don't use them, and frankly, neither do they really.
And why not?
Well, first of all, I think there's something very nice about having the cover of the book there, and you're not supposed to judge it by its cover, but oftentimes the cover art is very nice, and if well done, can be very beautiful too. And for some books, especially like the big textbooks with like large prints and linos inside, that can be something really nice to actually have as well, just to see. On top of that, there's a feeling of accomplishment you get by having a thick stack of paper and then going through it. Whereas if you just have a thin little piece of electronics and you're just swiping across it, you don't get the same joy, I guess, out of it. Plus, books smell nicer.
I will go into a used bookstore, and I love that kind of old book smell, and the pages are almost falling apart. I also grew up without the option of the ebook. So for me, long car rides to Florida in my parents' van necessitated a lot of reading. So I kind of got used. It was very comforting to me when I was a kid, and I didn't have an iPhone, I didn't have a computer, I didn't have even a TV in my room. So when I was sick, there was part of the comfort was like the soup and the tea and my book. So there was always this kind of comfort that I felt going along with reading. And I still enjoy, reading before I go to sleep. It's so relaxing.
At the meeting in the fall, Mr. Mandel told the 9th grade parents that the OHS was increasingly going to go to ebooks for textbooks. Do you think that will also happen with novels at all? Or nonfiction assigned in English classes?
I think that it allows for a level of accessibility that could be really helpful to students, especially, if you're talking about an article or you're talking about a textbook, that I could see. I think it really just depends on the individual reader. Giving, like, the fact that I love to feel the book and turn the pages doesn't mean that every student needs to do that necessarily. So I kind of like the idea of having more options.
The other side of that is if you're requiring everybody to use an ebook and you're not even presenting the option of a physical one, anybody who can't access it, doesn't have a computer or anything, they're then cut off from it, which actually makes it less accessible. Yeah. So.
Right. Ms. Monaco, you want to talk about some of the other older books you brought?
Sure. Well, I brought The Catcher in the Rye. Yes. This is a book that kind of gets tossed back and forth between 9th grade and 11th grade, curriculum-wise. I was in 11th grade when I read it, unfortunately with a teacher who, was not inspirational. We'll just leave it at that. But now as a teacher, reading it again, I felt like, and teaching it to 9th graders a few years ago, I felt like this is a book, this is that book that, one of those books that everybody should read, and I understand why people feel so drawn to it. And if you help students see that Holden isn't just being whiny, that there's so much more to it than that, to him than that, he's actually much more relatable, I think, than people initially realize. And there's so much digging to be done with this book.
Benjamin, have you read Catcher in the Rye?
I read it last year in 10th grade outside of school, just because I figured it was one of those books that was both interesting and something that I ought to read. I still find him a bit whiny.
Oh, yes.
But I definitely thought it was a good book. And just now in English, we were reading Farewell to Arms. And I was able to find some parallels between the two, just in terms of the way that their style is set up. And that may not be the most common comparison, but I did find it interesting from a stylistic perspective as well.
Syntax-wise.
Yeah.
The and then.
Mhm.
Benjamin, what else have you brought to share with
Well, completely different sort of book. I have this one called Pasta by Design, which sounds like a cookbook, but it's actually more of a mathematics book. And inside, it gives a brief history of pasta and various other things, but it also takes various types of pasta and gives you mathematical equations for them, along with cooking instructions. And as I like both math and science and food and everything, this was actually a really cool gift that I got a while back. So it's just something really neat to look through.
And that also looks like a book that probably would not work well as an ebook unless there were added elements to it.
No, probably not. I mean, there would certainly be cool things that you could do if it were in an ebook format. I mean, just thinking about it right now, maybe there would be some way to actually look and manipulate the graphs of all of these pasta shapes, I guess. But there's something about having books like this, which are or art books or things like that just are on your coffee table maybe, that are just nice to be able to hold and leaf through, which isn't exactly something you can easily do with an ebook.
Right. Ms. Marinero, you want
Sure.
any other recommendations?
Well, one of my favorite authors is Augustine Burroughs. Not something that we would ever teach in school. Never, ever would we ever, at least not at the high school level.
Explain
probably.
Why. In a
Augustine had, well, he wrote Running with Scissors.
is it language?
Yeah,
Language
it's
and
language
subject?
about subject.
Subjects?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I can't say never. I mean, certainly at a SUNY level or with upperclassmen. But he had a very dark childhood. He wrote Running with Scissors, which was his memoir of his childhood and also became a film. But then he has these collections of shorter memoirs. They are so funny that and he writes about these dark experiences in such a funny way that I will laugh out, like in public, laugh out loud and embarrass myself, because he's hysterical. So I'm going to read one paragraph because it's funny. This is called Mint Threshold.
Oh, boy.
It was a low point in my career when I found myself as the sole copywriter on the Junior Mints account. The concern is, the account executive explained, growth. How do we grow this business? Because our consumer research shows people have a mint threshold, and they're just not willing to cross it. He frowned when he said this. Worry was etched on his forehead. Poverty, global warming, the threat of terrorism. I wanted to laugh and then scream and punch my eardrums out with pens. So this is about his working for Junior Mints and people's mint threshold. So
Right.
that was very tame, but he, yeah, he's really good for a laugh.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's one way of making a book appealing, saying you might not be allowed to read it, and
Yeah, that's true.
banned in Boston for that.
Yeah.
And what book do you think most influenced you as a younger student?
Well, there are quite a few of those. One thing that I've been particularly fond of through the years are books that emphasize the power of innocence and imagination in particular. So The Phantom Tollbooth and The Little Prince were probably the two biggest influences as I was growing up.
Wow.
Both of which I read in kindergarten or
In
perhaps
kindergarten?
before.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you were,
Doesn't surprise me.
that's great. Do you read much what's now labeled young adult, YA, which is a growing part of the publishing industry?
I've read some. I tend to stay away because it inevitably turns to romance, which isn't my favorite genre.
Okay.
But there are a large number of good YA books out there. I mean, if you want to count Hunger Games as YA, which it's pretty certain it does,
Yes.
I've read those and I like them, some of the books more than others. There's ones by, I forget her first name, but an author named Haddix, She's written a number of post-apocalyptic ones, which seem to be the trend nowadays.
Yes.
But these were a while back, just about a future in which you can't have any more than one child, and what happens to the people who have more than two. And some of those things were very interesting. So I appreciate and respect the genre, but it's not what I'm most frequently reading.
Ms. Bonner, is there room in the curriculum for popular YA books for students to read?
Absolutely. I don't know about the high school level. I think there might be some, that you could have a high interest YA novel that's also high level reading, but that's a little bit harder to find. At the middle school level, absolutely. I remember when I taught middle school, I actually read Twilight because my students were all reading it. So I said, well, now I have to read it because I want to know what they're talking. I wanted to kind of engage and have those conversations. But certainly I find the YA books more at the middle school level versus high school.
Have either of you read any of the John Green books that have now become
Yes.
bestsellers?
I have not actually.
Okay.
Don't do it. You're going to cry.
Okay.
All right, I get his science magazine, Mental Floss, but that's about it. So I've heard that they're good, and apparently they're good enough to make a movie and a cult, but...
Definitely a cult following. I read The Fault in Our Stars because my students made me. And I made the mistake of, I never get books on CD because I like the book. But I drive to Philadelphia often. My best friends live there. So I said, let me get a book on not CD, on iPod. And I listened to it, and I'm driving, and I'm just sobbing on the way home because I won't say what happens. But it was it was so moving that I refuse to watch the movie now because it was so sad. But I also think being a parent and reading about sick children puts a different spin on it as well. But it's had a big effect on my students for sure, that book.
Right. And you know the backstory of that, about how
there was a girl, right, who he knew?
Right. He was, very briefly, after college, tried to be a chaplain, and he said he was not very good at it. Yeah. He met this young, well, I guess that may have been later. That's right. He was a chaplain, and he got the idea to write a novel about a young girl with cancer, and he said he couldn't get it right. He couldn't get the voice of the girl right, and he gave up. And then he became a novelist. He wrote several novels, and he met this girl at a convention, a Harry Potter convention in Boston called, I think, like the LeakyCon, I think. And she was, anyway, they became friends, and she, turned out, had cancer. And not to give too much away, but he said that Hazel is the character in the novel, right?
Yes.
Hazel. Grace was the real girl.
Wow.
Hazel is not Grace, but if he had not met Grace, he never would have been able to create Hazel.
That's great.
And then Grace's parents put together a book after she died called This Star Won't Go Out or something. Anyway, so there's an incredible backstory there that he's talked about a lot. Wow. Okay. Other books. We have a little bit of time left.
All right.
Okay.
Well, now I need to decide between which of these two I'll say.
Okay.
I guess I'll go with this one. It's called The Dark is Rising by Susan Cooper. It's a bit older than the other books in my stack, although still not an old book by any means. And it's another fantasy-type book, which I tend to read a lot. But this one is interesting because it takes place in England, but as part of the plot, and I'm going to try to say it without revealing too much, it takes place in England at multiple times, although still with the same characters and things. And it has a nice system of magic in it, and a nice story that actually interconnects a lot of English myths as well, which is something that I like to see a lot in books, the use of actual real-world myths as well. And it also takes place in winter, and the winter solstice, which is coming up soon, so it's very apt. So.
Okay. See some. Ms. Montanaro, do you want to mention,
Sure.
have one more recommendation?
I did not like poetry until college, and ever since then I love it. So trying to get middle and high school kids to buy into it has been challenging. But I've always been a big fan of, well, not always, since college, of Lucille Clifton, who really deals a lot with the intersectionalities of being a woman and of race. And these poems, and there's a memoir in here as well, are from 1969 to 1980. So this is always good for a kind of revisit. And they're short, they're accessible, but there's of course many layers going on in her work.
Right.
So.
And you also brought a Jean-Paul Lahari.
I did,
right?
Lahiri, yes.
Who is Indian American, I believe, right?
Yes, we read this with our 10th grade. Some 10th grade classes read this, so I read this last year with my 10th graders.
And
for
I
the
read it
first
last
time.
year as
You read
well.
it last year too. She writes in an interview. She talked about how her parents, who immigrated from India, this idea that they kind of lived their lives. She gave the analogy of trying to balance down a river with one foot in two different boats and trying to kind of balance. And so that's really what her main character, Gogol, or Nikhil, is his good name. That's what he goes through, this idea of being born to Indian parents, but being an Americanized child, and then how that affects his relationships as he gets older.
And was there a movie, I think? Was there a movie?
Yes, it was a really good movie, and I did like it. It was very different. I felt it was very different from the book, but not in itself. It was great, but not as a side-by-side comparison at all.
Right. Okay. I brought a book that's just out it's called Lives in Ruins, Archaeologists and the Seductive Lure of Human Rubble. It's a nonfiction book. The author, Marilyn Johnson, is a friend of mine, so I should acknowledge that. In journalism, that would be a conflict of interest. You've learned about that at the Current? You have. Has the Current dealt with any conflicts of interest?
Not yet.
Okay, but you're aware of the idea.
Oh, yes.
Okay, but anyway, I got to know Marilyn lives in Briarcliff, and I had reviewed her first book called The Deadbeat, which was a collection of stories about people who write obituaries and the art of writing obituaries, which was, believe it or not, a very funny book and also gracefully written. And then I discovered she lived in Westchester, and we became friends. So I can't review her books now, but I can recommend them in a different way. And this is it's a series of profiles of people who work as archaeologists, which is something I know very little about. The title has a double meaning, since to be an archaeologist for most people is a struggle to survive or to make a living at it. One of the most interesting chapters is set in Fishkill nearby, where there's an effort to restore and explore the old Fishkill Army Depot, which was very important during the Revolutionary War and is now threatened by suburban shopping center development, which is the whole story of archaeology, how people who want to preserve things have to fight commercial pressures. Anyway, so it's very readable. Her second book, she's now written 3 books, is about libraries, and it's called "This Book is Overdue!" How librarians and cybrarians, which is librarians on the online, can save us all, and it's about the new digital world of libraries, and again, very readable and lots of local things. And if I have time, one more book which should be of interest to high school readership, both students, teachers, parents. Came out last year. It's called Drama High. Subtitle is The Incredible True Story of a Brilliant Teacher, a Struggling Town, and the Magic of Theater. Wow. And it's set in, it's nonfiction, and it's set in Levittown, Pennsylvania, which is a struggling sort of blue-collar old factory town, and about the high school there and how this teacher, without a lot of resources, turned it into the high school for theater productions. Wow. I know Ossining High School has a very vibrant theater program as well. But this is it's a great story about how one teacher can make a big difference in the lives of his or her students. So on that note, what are you going to read next? What's on your reading list? Whether assigned or for fun. We have about 1 minute, I think.
That's a good question.
Quick.
Well, assigned was I'm going to be reading The Great Gatsby in English class.
Excellent.
It should be fun. I started reading it a while ago, but never finished, so it should be good.
Okay, it's not narrow. What's on your reading list?
Farewell to Arms, because my former students are reading it in 11th grade.
Okay, great. On that note, we end the 3rd edition of Ossining Reads. We'll see you again next month with a new co-host and a new reader. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
Benjamin
Thank you.
Nathan.